Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks. And for the last of Kybor's decks, we have Jon Irenicus Shattered One. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is a donate deck that looks to donate unblockable creatures to your opponents. Thank you again, Kybor, for supporting the channel. And as always, the deck list will be in the video description below, and I highly recommend that you take a look at this deck list and see what we can change or improve for a deck that already has such a good core idea. So Kyber's message had a lot more to do with playing to a meta and playing in strategies than the deck building itself, but we're going to talk a little bit about both. So let's start by taking a look at the commander, figuring out what the strategy is, figuring out what is going wrong, and what deck building and what gameplay decisions can we make to improve the deck. So our commander is Jon Irenicus. Irenicus? I'm not sure. Jon. We're going to call him Jon. Jon is an elf wizard, 4 mana, blue black, 3/3, that says at the beginning of your end step, you give a creature to one of your opponents, give it 2+1/+1 counters, tap it, and then it's goaded for the rest of the game and can't be sacrificed. Then, whenever a creature you own but don't control attacks, you draw a card. So, what does this look like in practice? In practice, this looks like you are giving your opponents creatures they have to attack each other with, and every time one of those attacks goes off, you draw a card. What this also looks like in practice is that as soon as you can put down your commander, you start a timer. And each turn he's on the battlefield, you give one more permanent. I guess it's not a timer, it's more of an increment. Which means per turn cycle, in theory, you are drawing an additional card each time. So this is kind of like a critical mass deck, and its greatest enemy is this being reset. It takes a really long time for this deck to get going. Like, if you consider the fact that you're adding one card per turn, if the board is wiped, you're starting at 0, and if you are at 4 creatures, like, each 2 of your opponents each have 2 of your creatures, in order to get back to that level, you first have to recast your commander and the card you want to give your opponent, and then you can start rebuilding that board. So this is the kind of deck that I really like counterspells in, and I really like any form of mass reanimation could be useful, anything like that, because board clears are very, very detrimental. Now, the way that Kybor is using this deck is by giving a bunch of evasive or unblockable creatures and forcing your opponents to attack each other with that in mind. There's also a few clone effects, so you get multiple ones of your multiple versions of your commander in play, and therefore can benefit even more. But that's generally the main game plan. Your creatures are going to mainly be 3/3s from what I can see, and with that in mind, are going to be picking at the opponents in the battlefield. Now, Kybor says that one of the difficulties that they are experiencing is that one of the people in their pod, in their commander pod, plays life gain, and there's become this kind of problem where the other players pick on the life gain player because the life gain player has a lot of health, but all that does is kind of dull the effect of the commander because damage is not being spread around evenly. Instead, it's just kind of evening out the life totals. And this deck's main finisher is to cast Extenuate or Torment of Hellfire for a really large amount of mana to knock people out of the game. And that is difficult to do when everyone is at a higher life total. They have considered maybe giving the life gain player the creatures instead, but are worried that that will lead to prolonged games. So let's talk strategy before we talk about cards. I think you should absolutely give those creatures to the life gain player. A single life gain player tends not to be that scary. Life gain players take a really long time to do anything and oftentimes benefit from the fact that they are relatively ignored at the table. There's very few, astronomically oppressive life gain, win conditions. And though I used to play a life gain deck, I really played it for the paying life. So unless they're playing like I played Eiley was my black white life gain commander to gain literal millions of life, and then you'd use cards like Necropotence and the like to spend that life on cards. But if they don't have a way to spend all of their life, that life is just kind of a buffer that means nothing. And so we can leave the life gain player last and find different ways to take them out. Um, the other thing is I think okay, hold on. Let's get to some cards and let's look at the deck list first before we go any further because a lot of the strategy is going to be based on the cards that we look at. Really quickly, we can see the mana curve is pretty nice. 3 is kind of low, 2 is kind of high, but at that point, it's not too much of a problem. I believe a lot of that has to do with the fact that the best, 1 and 2 drops are the unblockable creatures, and also we're aiming to play our commander on turn 3, which makes perfect sense. So the lack of 3 drops makes sense if we assume our commander's there. Now, we have a bit of a sideboard of cards that are being considered, I assume, and I might suggest a few of them in now because they're already here. The first thing I want to point out is that we seem to have a very large land count. Like there's quite a few here. 38 is already high, but you're in addition playing a whole swath of ramp and artifact-based ramp, which is fine, but usually we can cut down on lands to do so. Now, one might point out that when your goal is to hit Torment of Hailfire as hard as you can, you generally want a lot of lands in play. But Torment of Hailfire doesn't really work that way, right? There's generally a kind of sweet spot. Once you hit like 10 plus mana, you're generally good because, 8 times 3 is 24 damage. But if you are able to use Cabal Coffers, which is kind of the main idea here, which we have, right? That 10 lands produces way more mana, and then Torment of Hailfire is almost always completely lethal. Alternatively, you could use a copy spell to copy Torment of Hailfire, but I don't think that's necessarily the direction we want to go into. So I think we can cut some lands without too much problems. I think the Evil Eyes also stick out here being a little strange because they kind of prevent a player from attacking with their other goaded creatures. And Evil Eye of Urborg is particularly bad because it doesn't have evasion. Ormsby has evasion, but Evil Eye just destroys a creature when it gets blocked, and I don't think that's as good. So I would consider cutting both for sure. But let's go back here and let's take a look at some cards that you have in your sideboard that I think you should play. Vorpal Sword is definitely a card you should play because you have the means to make it work. You have a game plan that involves getting a ton of mana, and you have evasive creatures. Yes, the second you play this card, everyone's going to panic and try to take you out or stop it, but that's not necessarily the worst thing. You can just leave this in your hand till the end of the game. You can leave it on the battlefield to distract your opponents. You can make deals with them. Especially if you have a life gain opponent, the ability to just end the game is really, really, really. It's the best way to end the game. Turn a 1/1 into a creature that does 100 or more damage based on their opponent's life. Fantastic. I think this should be in here for sure. Another way to deal with life gain is Blighted Agent. This is another card, much like Vorpal Sword, that I don't recommend you just run out. In fact, what I would do is this is the kind of card you play late in the game, especially if you're in a one-on-one situation with the life gain player. Because what you can do is you can combo Blighted Agent with Homeward Path, where you keep giving them the Blighted Agent after you attack with it, and then after it gets the +2/+2 counters, you take it back. Now, it's going to be goaded forever, and you won't be able to sacrifice it, but that's not really a problem. Every time you attack, so the first attack they have 1 infect, the second attack they have 4 infect, the third attack they have 9 infect. That's pretty good. That's a 4-turn clock right there. And if you have any other ways to increase its power, it's a 3-turn clock. I think that's pretty good. Something like Swiftfoot Boots could definitely be in here. Lightning Greaves is already better, but it is a card for sure. Where's the one I'm looking for? I think Assault Suit should be in here as another version of your commander's ability. And since it goes around the entire table, you'll get several triggers off of one creature. It is a lot to cast and a lot to equip, but I think it's still worth playing and considering. You want some redundancy to what your commander does. Going a bit lower, we have Dissipation Field, and I would definitely play Dissipation Field over No Mercy. Dissipation Field is just superior. No Mercy feels like No Mercy and Dissipation Field are generally, they feel like they are what do you call it? They're preventative, but they're really not, because once you have 10 life, someone's going to attack you with a 10/10. That's just how it is, right? They're willing to sacrifice the creature, bounce it back into hand to get the effect. But otherwise, they're generally wary about it. Now, you can also use Dissipation Field to do politics. If your opponent has Eternal Witness and they want to, cast it again, they can attack into your Dissipation Field, and you can make a deal that you won't block it in exchange for a favor or exchange for some kind of effect, right? But the really important reason I want to say Dissipation Field is better is that once you're down to just you and an opponent, you can just get your creatures back. It's pretty relevant. Goad only works until it doesn't. When you're the only player left, the goad has to come at you, and therefore you prefer to get your creatures back rather than them to be in the graveyard. Remember, at the end of the day, that hit is still coming through. So would you like to draw a card off of getting hit, or would you like to just destroy their? Sorry, let's say, would you like to destroy their creature and draw a card, or just destroy their creature, right? And I think it's very clear it's better to use Dissipation Field in that way. Then finally, Shieldred Whispering One is pretty cool with the fact that your opponents can't sacrifice your creatures, so they are kind of blanks for Shieldred, but it's not really where you want to be. You can't really use her reanimation ability particularly well, whereas the Progress Tyrant I feel like is the one you should be playing, because you can copy your cast of Torment of Hellfire or Exsanguinate, which I think is much, much stronger. And also Jin-Gitaxias has a really strong kind of neutral passive ability and can really damper the battlefield. It's really powerful when you have 3 opponents and you're like countering several spells a turn, unless they're playing creatures, which they probably will. But that kind of attracts a lot of attention. So sometimes Jin-Gitaxias is really good, like the turn before you win the game, right? When you play Jin-Gitaxias, it has to make it 1 cycle, and then you cast, Torment of Hellfire, and you win the game. All right, so what other suggestions do I have? In Kai Brewer's message to me, there was some notes of a inclusion of a series of cards to pressure our opponents that he liked from the Most Dangerous Gamer video. So for that purpose, I'm going to show a few of those cards here, namely cards like Oppression. Whenever a player plays a spell, that player discards a card from his or her hand, their hand. Bottomless Pit, that says during each player's upkeep, that player discards a card at random. And Painful Quandary, that says whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. Also very similar is Liliana of the Veil, for each player to discard a card. So the reason I'm really comfortable adding these kind of cards into this deck is that At the base level, you should be drawing at least two cards per turn cycle, right? One from your commander's effect of one of the creatures, and one on your regular draw, which puts you positive into this kind of interaction. The other thing is that Painful Quandary is very, very functional at slowly draining out your opponent's life here and there, especially those who want to play a lot of cards. And with that in mind, it does empower your kind of, aggressive pinging people for damage with your unblockables kind of strategy. In the same way, I would also suggest Tainted Remedy. I know this feels like it's a little particularly hating on that life gain opponent, but I mean, all's fair in love and war. If your deck loses to life gain, you should have an answer in your deck. Tainted Remedy is a nice, clean answer that punishes players for gaining life in uncontrollable ways. Their soul sisters become incredibly detrimental very, very quickly. One of them does. The other one has a May trigger. Also, if you want something a little more swingy, Archfiend of Despair is equally strong. It stops life gain, and at each end step, each opponent loses. They get the damage they've taken again, or I guess the loss of life again at the end of turn. Now, 8 mana is a lot for this ability, so I'm going to be a little wary about it. But the reason I kind of like it is that you can give someone the Archfiend of Despair. Now, they don't lose double life, but the other two players do, and I think that's really, really good. You can even give the Archfiend of Despair to the life gain player, but I mean, that's neither here nor there. I think sometimes if they've already gained a lot of life, you want them to take double life. But if you give them the now 8/8 demon, I think it'll be fine for them to be able to attack others while still not gaining life in the meantime. It might at least give them a consolation prize, if that makes sense. Then I'm going to suggest one other card when it comes to card draw. I think the deck itself is doing very well in kind of a general card draw uh, deck. I want to recommend Scourge Familiar. I think you already play cards that have no maximum hand size. Let's see, at least Thought Vessel. And are you playing? I can't remember what the other one's called, but I don't see it. Oh, Reliquary Tower. There it is. So you're already playing cards that have a stop you from discarding to hand size. But the truth of the matter is, the majority of the cards you'll be drawing will be not on your turn, so you don't have to worry about discarding to hand size. Scourge Familiar gives you something to do with some of those cards. Now, one card for 1 mana is a pretty bad rate, but its ability to allow you to cast a few extra cards here and there is pretty strong, I would say. Depending on how these games end, especially if you are in a situation where you've gotten very far ahead and you just need to be able to, you know, push in a few extra points of damage on Torment of Hailfire, because each card in your hand becomes 3 damage. That's a pretty good deal. I think I would definitely go for that. If you use it to kind of like sneak in an extra card or an extra effect, I think it's maybe not as good. But at the end of the game, a lot of these unblockable creatures aren't going to be particularly strong, and being able to at least turn them into mana, I think, is worthwhile. It's similarly why I think Bottomless Pit, Oppression, and Liliana the Veil aren't too bad for you to play, because you are going to have cards to discard. So I think it's helpful. Something I didn't think of before, but I'm thinking of now is Aether Vial. It's not usually a card that I recommend in Commander because it's kind of super, super specific to creature decks, and it doesn't always work out. It's a dead draw later in the game, but I think you have the means to take advantage of it. The majority of your deck is at 2 mana. Being able to violate an unblockable creature that you can hit with and then donate is pretty good. And then it also, once again, it gives you a means to get rid of the extra cards that are always going to be in your hand. Trying to think if there was anything else before I go to the next point, but think that's generally it. So the last thing, this is kind of cheeky. I don't know how good this is and to what degree you actually want to invest in, but how about proliferate? Proliferate is interesting here because you can use it with, yes, infect counters to kind of give someone a blighted agent, let them attack a few opponents, and then proliferate the rest of the way there. But it's more than I'm thinking that one of the big things about your unblockable creatures is that they don't grow. It is pretty difficult to get a uh, +1/+1 counters on your opponent's creatures in these colors. But since they already have the counters when you pass them over to an opponent, cards like Flux Channeler and cards like Inexorable Tide here are pretty good at doing that. Inexorable Tide, I think, is a much better version of Channeler because it has a higher, it's any spell you cast, you proliferate, and you're going to have lots of low mana spells to cast. But I think Flux Channeler is fine too. I think if you try to think of it as these cards being really good after you've given out 2 or 3 creatures, I think it is something to really consider of the difference between handing someone a 3/3 unblockable and handing someone a 5/5 unblockable. That amount of damage is going to grow really, really quickly, but also it does give you another method of defeating your opponents. Because as you know, once the game gets to a position where you can start taking your opponents out, you need to regain those creatures. And I could be wrong, but I believe those cards stop existing because they belong in your opponent's battlefield. So when your opponent has, like, it's not like a when you enchant something and gain mind control spell. Like mind control, their mind control disappears and you then get the creature back. But I think in this case, you don't get the creatures back when they die. When your opponent loses. Do you get your creatures back, Jon EDH? When a player loses. I'm just curious what someone says. Scene ending, the control change effect. Okay. All right. That's interesting. Okay. I did not know that. It's good to know that you will get the creatures back. So if you get the creatures back, you want those creatures to be bigger. And so all of the effort you put into growing the +1/+1 counters with Inexorable Tide, those will benefit you because those creatures will return to you stronger. I think that's an interesting thing you can do. I gave these two as the best proliferate cards. I think it is a different direction you can take the deck into, and you're gonna probably have different mileage based on like which cards you use. Like there's definitely some differences of which cards are really good for the proliferate plan and which ones are bad. Something like Thrumming Bird can be really good because not only do you give it to an opponent and they start hitting and they will probably continuously proliferate the Thrumming Bird, but they might not. And you might have to play the Thrumming Bird kind of fairly, where you just play it as a Thrumming Bird and you do the attacking to proliferate the team. I don't know how feasible that's going to be, but it is an option. I generally like the proliferate options that can be done over and over again, which there's not that many, honestly, that are particularly good in these colors. There's a lot of one-offs that are fine. Staff of Completion might be something you can consider. That's 3 life to proliferate every turn, but that does add up. And then otherwise, Vraska Betrayal Sting was one that I was really close to suggesting. I ended up saying no, but maybe it's something to consider. I just think when you grow these creatures, like these creatures are already coming up with counters, and as you grow them turn by turn, they become bigger and bigger threats. And that is a way to this is a way to increase their threat in kind of a slow way that isn't, you know, that doesn't attract too much attention. Because each plus one, like it's not one of those plus one counter decks where you're constantly putting plus one counters. It would be probably once per turn cycle. And they're already used to the fact that you're giving out a creature each turn cycle and therefore are in a pretty good position. One card that I just thought of that could be worth playing is Sleeper Agent. Sleeper Agent is a 1 mana creature that you naturally give to an opponent, and in exchange for dealing 2 damage to them per turn, they have a 3/3. However, it has no evasion, and it is not goaded. So, if you would play this, you have to make a deal with a player. You basically play it and you say who wants the Sleeper Agent. Hopefully, someone does because it benefits their game plan, and then you ask them to attack with it every turn in exchange. If they say yes, you got a good deal. If they say no, well, you did your best. If they take it, and they don't attack with it, well, they're getting pinged every turn, so that's something. If they take it, they're probably going to want to attack with it because there's always going to be open attacks on your opponents. So I think there's a low chance that this card doesn't get used. It's just another 1 mana card that I think is worth using. All right. I think that's generally a lot of what I have to say about this deck. This deck is in an interesting position that it's kind of hard to give a lot of advice on it. I think, as you've noted, it at this point it's more of a gameplay kind of consideration and not so much of a deck consideration. I've suggested the more prison-y archetypes in black with bottomless pit and oppression, and I've suggested a proliferate sub-theme, and it's up to you to consider if you want to go into these. Each of these packages are probably like, I don't know, 5 to 7 cards, so it wouldn't be that disruptive, but you probably can't play both, so I would be kind of picky on which ones to play. I would be really interested in seeing another draft of this deck, especially when you choose the direction it wants to be in. And I would love to see any draft of anyone's deck, which anyone can send me in the link that's in the video description below. It links to a form for you to fill out. And if you'd like to also skip the line, there is a link down there so that your deck assist video is the next one I do. Otherwise, if you guys could do the whole YouTube thing of like, commenting, and subscribing, I think it would be very helpful for the channel. I'm looking at this deck and I really do like it. I think it's a really interesting take on this kind of, give people creatures deck. I immediately think of Voidwalker, I think is not there. Dothy Voidwalker can fit in very nicely as a shadow creature. Now it has an interesting kind of trade where your opponent will get a pretty good effect out of it, but it's still a rest in peace effect while it comes like while it's in play. I think I would definitely give this to an opponent, if nothing else. I think it is. They can't use the effect anyways, can they? Because they need to be able to sacrifice it, and they cannot. Okay, yeah, absolutely play the Voidwalker. It is a 5 power unblockable rest in peace effect. That doesn't affect the player who has it. It affects you, unfortunately, but you can't have it all. All right, with that in mind, I think that's the last thing I can think of. I think this deck could be really, really cool. Obviously, as you can see, there's a lot of different ways and different cards that can belong into a deck like this. And so it can be a little tricky to find exactly the cards that we want. This is probably a longer term deck where you have to spend, a long time refining it to find what exactly fits. Because on paper, it's kind of hard to see exactly how well the deck is going to perform until you play with it. There's a lot of politics involved, and then this is the kind of deck that's really dependent on what your opponents are playing, like you realize with your life gain opponent. All right, good luck, and I hope I see this deck again soon.